And you are about to see The Emperor Has No Clothes, Insecurities and Security Infrastructure. Speakers are Ben Feinstein, Jeff Jarmoc, and Dan King. Please give them a good welcome.
Thanks, everyone. First off, just wanted to thank y'all for joining us here this morning. I know there's plenty of other talks you could go to, so I'm flattered that you would join us. So just a brief introduction. My name is Ben Feinstein. I run a small research team for SecureWorks out of Atlanta, Georgia. On my left here is Jeff Jarmoc, who's one of our firewall engineers out of our Chicago operation. And over here is Daniel King, who works out of our Providence, Rhode Island office doing security engineering. So this talk is really about the discovery of a series of security vulnerabilities in security infrastructure, and talking about what are the impact of these vulnerabilities, why you should care, and making recommendations for how enterprises should better secure and consider their security infrastructure within scope for their security program. So in today's world of regulation, compliance, PCI, all these different acronyms, your security infrastructure really represents controls in the sense of an auditor who is looking for controls in that regulatory environment. So these are high-value targets. These are the systems that are keeping the bad guys out and keeping your data within your environment. Many times, particularly with firewalls or network devices, these systems are in charge of separating physical or logical zones of trust or different zones of trust within an environment. And in the case of IPS, IDS, or network devices, many times they're active or passive defensive systems. So they may be modifying traffic on the network, they may be injecting traffic on that network, or they may simply be monitoring all the traffic. And that's important to note, is that these systems, firewalls, IDS, IPS, the security infrastructure of your enterprise, has a very sensitive position of trust. It is monitoring vast amounts of data crossing the network. It is in charge of enforcing controls and logical separations on that data. So when these systems fail, or when they're attacked or subverted, the impacts can be pretty severe. So just to look at, what's the outcome of an attacker successfully exploiting some of your gear, some of your infrastructure? From the least severe, it really could be a denial of service, right? An attacker may not be able to take complete control over your firewall, but he may have a bug or a vulnerability that could impact the availability of your networks, right? And for inline devices and firewalls and inline IPSs, they can completely impact your availability in a sort of denial of service situation. But getting even more severe and more serious, an attacker can gain control of device configurations and device policies in the environment. Frequently, the attacker's goal here might be to squelch alerts about the intrusion that they're committing, potentially drop the shields or reduce security controls or security data exfiltration, or open up new back channels and new firewall holes for the attacker to further impact your environment. But also, for VPN concentrators, firewalls, those devices, they hold cryptographic keys, they hold VPN keys, and sensitive credentials. So if an attacker is able to get control of these devices, they may be able to pull out your VPN keys or your cryptographic keys to your environment. That can obviously lead to eavesdropping, but also it can allow the attacker to pivot through your environment into other systems. So without further ado, I want to pass this off to Jeff Jarmoc. Jeff will be talking about some vulnerabilities we discovered in Cisco ASA Management Console and Cisco ASA itself, and also we'll be attempting a live demo of the TLS renegotiation bug, which we did not discover. That was Steve Dispenza and Marsh Ray disclosed it in November. But we have proof of concept of how you can use this against the Cisco management infrastructure.
All right, hi everybody. So the first thing we're going to talk about is an ACL bypass vulnerability in Cisco ASA. We discovered this last year and worked with Cisco to identify root cause, and they were responsive in developing a patch. So this is a patch vulnerability at this point. Throughout this, when we're talking about ASA, one point I like to highlight is that just because they're patched in release doesn't mean they're patched in production. As Ben was saying, all too often, infrastructure is treated as network infrastructure, and oftentimes, depending on network architecture, there's downtime involved to upgrade. So It's kind of a problem that these things tend to be out of date and contain known vulnerabilities. Cisco ASA, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, is Cisco's flagship firewall platform. It's the successor to the popular PIX firewalls, but it has some other features that are interesting too. It's also a VPN terminator for both IPsec and SSL VPNs, and it also has IPS and content security web filtering capabilities through additional add-on modules. So it does a bit more than what people typically think of as firewalling. It seems that the trend in the industry is to ask our firewalls to do more and more, with moves toward UTM appliances and things. And I find that concerning. The more functionality you have, the more avenues of attack are available. So it's sort of a concerning trend from that perspective. So let me get to the next slide. So there's two methods that the ASA uses for deciding how to filter traffic. When there's an ACL bound to an interface, it evaluates it in top-down order. The first rule that matches is the rule that's action is taken, whether it be allowing the traffic, denying it, rejecting it. If there's no rule that matches, the traffic is processed by a default deny rule. So at the bottom of every ACL, you can think of there being a rule that drops everything, even though it's not explicitly displayed. That's the documented behavior. When there's no ACLs bound to an interface, what happens is that there's a numeric security level that determines how the traffic's handled. So traffic is allowed from an interface to any other interfaces with a lower security level. I'll explain that a little bit further. It can be a little strange to get your head around. So this is an example configuration for an ASA firewall. There's a lot of text here, but it's really fairly straightforward. There's three groups there for each of our interfaces, Ethernet 00, 01, 02. In this case, you see that Ethernet 00 is configured as our outside interface. It's named outside, and it has a security level 0, so that is the least trusted interface representing the internet. Our DMZ interface then, our inside interface is security level 100, so that's our most trusted interface, and the DMZ sits in the middle, security level 50. So what this represents is if there were no ACLs, traffic would be allowed from the internal network to go to the DMZ network or the outside network. Traffic from the DMZ would only be allowed to the outside network, and traffic coming in from the outside would be dropped regardless of destination because it's a completely untrusted interface. So that sort of explains that security level behavior. We have also a couple of access control lists here, just basically denying everything explicitly on the outside. On the inside, we've got a sample rule that's allowing HTTP and HTTPS, as well as DNS to a server that sits in the DMZ. And then the DMZ access list allows outbound SMTP and DNS traffic from our servers. So this is kind of a sample of a pretty basic configuration. So what happens when these commands are put in the wrong order? Instead of using the access group command to bind an access list after it's created, what happens if we try to bind an access list that doesn't exist? What we see is that the newer versions of ASA will give you an error message that says access group does not exist. But it seems that on some prior unknown to me version, it would accept that command, and then when you created the access list, it would process it with the normal behavior. So what happens is when you've done that on a prior version, when you upgrade to the versions that are affected by this bug, the default deny that's implicit at the end of the ACL is not applied. So the effect of that is that our default deny behavior is bypassed. Essentially what's happening is that the behavior changes from the documented behavior when an access list is bound to deny anything by default to the behavior that's a little bit less secure with the security level, the numeric security level filtering. So when you're relying on the security levels, you're allowed outbound, as we discussed earlier, from a higher security to a lower security level interface. So this bug doesn't allow inbound ACL bypass. It's only outbound ACL bypass. But that's still concerning. You know, a lot of times you want to restrict your outbound traffic, so you're blocking things like phone home traffic for malware, botnet command and controls, you know, possibly second stage downloaders, you know, maybe connect back shells and those sorts of things. So this is a pretty significant, you know, vulnerability in how the traffic filtering occurs. It's also pretty hard to identify when this is actually affecting you. There's essentially two ways to know that this is affected. The first is simply through analyzing your logs. This is actually how we first came across this. You know, we noticed through log analysis that all of a sudden our outbound drops, you know, went to zero. You know, rather than dropping outbound traffic that's not allowed, we weren't seeing anything outbound being dropped in the logs, and you know, began investigating the root cause. One thing to note here is that you'll only get these syslog messages since it's showing built connections. You have to be logging at a more verbose level in order to see those logs, and that is something that people don't commonly do. A lot of people are generally not concerned about logging traffic that's permitted. You know, since it's permitted, they're not concerned about it. But you know, it's important to monitor that traffic and confirm that the permitted traffic is traffic that you meant to permit. The other way to identify that it's misbehaving is by using the built-in packet tracer on ASA. So what this allows you to do is simulate the flow of you know, a given packet through the ASA, and it identifies what rules and what actions are taken. This can be a really helpful troubleshooting tool because it'll you know, point you right at what's happening. And here we see in our example here an entry that indicates that the rule was allowed by an implicit rule, which again shouldn't be the behavior when there's an access list bound to the interface. You should only see this when you're relying on security levels. So it's not something that's super easy to identify. You know, when it's occurring, and that can make it even more nefarious. You know, if you're not aware that this behavior is occurring, then obviously you're not going to take action to prevent it. So there's a few different ways to mitigate this. You can upgrade to a patched version, and there's several different versions depending on what revision you're on. Or you can add an explicit deny entry to each ACL so that you're not relying on the implicit deny. Now, this isn't something that can be triggered remotely or at will by an attacker. So it's not really a weaponizable vulnerability, but it's still important, you know, that it points out the need to monitor what these devices are actually doing and verifying that you know, that the behavior it's exhibiting is what you intended. You can't really tell that this is occurring by looking at the configuration. So simple, you know, configuration auditing and strong change control and configuration control is really not sufficient. You need to actually monitor behavior. Yeah, there's Ben's reminding me, there's a CVE, and I thought I had that in the slides here. Well, here's Cisco's bug number that has more information. Maybe I don't have the CVE number here. I guess not. Yeah, it's in the white paper. There is a CVE entry for this issue from 2009, late 2009. So moving on, the next thing I want to talk about is some vulnerabilities I discovered in the web server, the integrated web server of ASA that supports the Adaptive Security Device Manager administration GUI. So I keep doing that. So for those of you who may never have seen it, the screenshot here is an example of what ASDM looks like. Essentially, it's a Java GUI that allows you to manage and monitor different aspects of the firewall configuration. It's meant to be a lot friendlier than the command line interface that can be kind of daunting to people when they're first learning it. You can launch this from the browser or install a package on your local machine. It runs through Java Web Start and uses HTTPS for communication back to the ASA. So